Hello and welcome to today's webinar training. My name is Alexandra Wade. I am a project manager here on the iSalus Healthcare team. I'd like to welcome you to our EMR Overview User Preferences training. Today we're going to be talking about really the main screen of the EMR, focusing on the Summary Chart tab and all of the additional user settings, or what we like to call user preferences, within that screen. There's going to be a couple of different things that we may be focusing on a little bit more than others today, but the main purpose of today's training is to be talking about those different settings and how you can use them to create your own customized experience within the EMR portal. So let's go ahead and get started. If this is your first kind of webinar training, we're going to be starting here at the login page. If you're not familiar with this screen, I am going to be using the database inside of Internet Explorer, which is the preferred browser for most users. However, the Choice platform is available also on Google Chrome. So as a provider, and this being a provider training, you will also have access to log in on Google Chrome. So depending on the type of machine that you're using, if it is a Windows machine, you may opt into utilizing Internet Explorer, but if you're on a Mac, you may also utilize Google Chrome. Now, by accessing the database, this is a cloud-based program, so you can access it utilizing the web. You're just going to go to OfficeMD, as in Mary David, .net. That's going to get you to the login page, where you will then see 3 user credentials that will allow you to log in as your user inside your own database. The first is your unique user ID. The second is your unique password. Now, if this is the first time you're logging in, you'll be given a temporary password. When you log in that first time, the system's going to have you change your password, so you'll be able to make it whatever you want. And then the third credential is going to be your company alias. So depending on which database you're logging into, you will have a kind of short username, or we like to call it a company ID or alias, to log into your own database. After logging in, it's going to take you into really a preferred destination in the database, depending on the type of user that you are. So for today's training, as a provider, the system is going to automatically take us over into the EMR because it knows that we're going to be seeing patients. Something else that you'll notice that's popping up on the screen is a required user communication preferences. We would ask that you go ahead and enter in your email here, just so that if we have something that we need to notify you about, or maybe we're letting you know about some new updates or something like that, go ahead and throw your email and your phone number in here so that we have an easy way of communicating with you in the future. Once you enter that communication preference in one time, you won't be notified to update that unless, for whatever reason, you need to. Now, again, focusing on today's training, we're going to be looking at some different ways to access information inside of the EMR portal. So first and foremost, we're going to take our mouse and we're going to navigate over to the far left-hand side of the screen. I want to point out in the upper left-hand corner, you have an area that is titled the My Task List. Now, the My Task List is always going to be listed in the upper left-hand corner. Our training today is not going to be focused on the My Task List, so if you're interested in learning more, please refer back to another training titled My Task List. Today, we're going to be looking at the middle of our left-hand navigation pane. We call this the Nav pane, or sometimes you'll hear us talk about setting your office schedule. That's what we're talking about over here on the far left-hand side. You'll notice that you have an interactive calendar that allows you to click on different dates that will then pull up appointments from that scheduled appointment date. If we go into today's date, you'll see we have different appointments that display over here just to the right of our navigation pane. Now, when you log into the database for the very first time, you want to double check that your office schedule is displaying. So we're going to go ahead and select the Office Schedule dropdown, which allows us to then pull up different schedules from the database. The first dropdown is always going to list out personnel or people. If you're trying to find a schedule for maybe a machine, a device, or maybe a location, you may need to choose those different options from this first dropdown. However, by default, your schedule should always display your schedule to begin with. The second drop-down, of course, will be your name. So select this drop-down, go in and find your provider name listed here so that it'll open up your scheduled appointments. Now, a couple of additional details that you'll see displayed underneath the drop-downs are a series of different checkboxes. These checkboxes will display different details on the actual scheduled appointment. These are set by total user preference, so you can choose what options you would like displayed on your schedule. Once you set these items one time, the system will remember what you've selected, and it will always present that same information until you were to choose or to change it. So if we look over here on our actual scheduled appointments, you can see the patient's name and their age, the time or duration of their appointment. You've also got an area here called the chief complaint. This may have been information that was entered by your front office staff or potentially your clinical staff, depending on that specific workflow. And you've also got your appointment status and the type of appointment. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out in our checkboxes is the ability to turn certain things on or off. If we choose to turn off the chief complaint, you'll see that that shrinks that appointment to allow for additional room for more appointments. If you turn it back on, of course, the appointment will grow and expand and allow for that additional room for the chief complaint to display. You've also got a checkbox to display your appointment status. So if you don't necessarily want to know if a patient is checked in or checked out or a no-show, you may opt out of that option. However, for most providers, I would recommend to leave that on. If your office chooses to utilize our room status, you may also see an additional option for some more room to display your room status. So maybe your nurse placed a patient in room 1, you could choose to turn that room status on to display that data. Now, maybe you only want to see checked-in patients or you want to see the time that they were checked in. You can obviously turn these additional data points on if you choose. And then the last couple of options that I want to explain how they're used is the Superbill SOAP status. I would recommend that every provider utilize this option. It is going to display 2 little red X's in the upper right-hand corner of the appointment. When you hover your mouse over the appointment, you're going to see a small pop-up kind of appear. At the bottom of this pop-up, you'll see a data point that says Superbill missing, progress note missing. The first red X displays the Superbill status. The second red X displays the progress note status. So by looking at these 2 appointments, we know that I am missing both my Superbill and my signed note. So at a quick glance, I can really kind of gauge where I'm at in my schedule and know that I need to go back and finish the documentation for both of these appointments. Now, eventually, when we get through some additional trainings, you'll see that those red X's will change to green check marks once those data points have been saved or signed off on. So when we see green check marks, we know we're good to go. Now, this Superbill SOAP status is great when you're looking at your schedule at a day-to-day glance. Overall, you will learn in a future training how to use the progress note section in the My Task List to better see your entire workload at a glance. So maybe at the end of the week, if you want to know, did I forget to do a progress note earlier in the week, you can obviously take a glance at the My Task List. This is constantly tallying up all of your to-do items, whereas your office schedule here is just showing you a visual indicator at a day-to-day glance. Our next checkbox is going to be the auto refresh. So if you are relying on your front office to check your patients in, check them out, mark them as a no-show, update their chief complaint, you may want to opt into this auto refresh so that the second a patient is checked in over in the iScheduler, your office schedule in the EMR will automatically refresh. If you choose to not turn this on, you will have to rely on the system to refresh at a timed update. So that may be timed every 3 minutes or every 5 minutes. overall, I would recommend to turn on the auto refresh so that you can let the system refresh it automatically every time there's an update made to an appointment in the iScheduler. The last option is the intake status. So if you are utilizing our intelligent intake feature, you may see some additional data displayed at the bottom of the appointment to let you know at what step your appointment is at in the intake process. So if a patient is filling out an intake, they may be at 30% of that intake or at 85%. We want to see how far along they are. Maybe they're checked in, but they're still in the waiting room. You can still see that intake status to see if your patient's getting a little closer to the finish line to fill out that paperwork. Now again, all of these check marks are user preferences. You can choose what options you want to turn on and which options you want to leave off depending on your own preference. Now navigating into the actual patient's chart, we're simply just going to select their scheduled appointment to open up their scheduled chart or their actual appointment data. Once we open up that chart, you're going to see a lot of information displayed on the screen here. You'll see the patient's name listed in the upper right-hand corner. That's how you know that that's the patient's chart that we're looking at. So if you ever see something a little bit different than what you were expecting, double check that patient that you clicked on to ensure that you're opening up the correct patient chart. Now, before we dive into this main screen, the summary screen, I want to take a little bit of time and focus over here on the far right-hand side. This is going to show us a lot of additional data, like a patient photograph. If your front office is choosing to include maybe a snapshot of the patient or even a copy of their driver's license, that information is going to display here under the patient photograph. Below that is what we call the patient AMP. This stands for allergies, medications, and problems. These are all current items. So if the patient does not have any current allergies, you'll see it will display no active allergies like it does here. Next in line is going to be our chart tabs. The chart tabs are going to display in a predetermined order for you. However, you can choose to change the order of these in whatever makes the most sense to your workflow. So think of the chart tabs as kind of the stepping stones to our completed note. We're going to take little bits of pieces of each of these chart tabs and we're going to put them together into one completed document. So think about documenting a little bit of the allergies, documenting the patient's past history or their medical history, their vitals, review of systems, ROS and HPI. All of that information is going to piece together into one completed note. Now, this order that you see here may not make the most sense for your workflow. You can choose to change the order of these chart tabs. To do so, simply right-click anywhere in this section and select Set Up Favorites. That's going to give you the option to then change the order of those chart tabs. Once you select Set Up Favorites, it's going to give you a whole list of different chart tabs. You can then choose to either turn them on or turn them off, depending on which chart tabs you need access to. And then you can change the order. So say, for example, I want vitals to be one of the first things that I see. Simply select the vitals chart tab and use the arrow in the far left-hand side to move it all the way up to the top. Then maybe we want the review of systems to be above history. We'll select review of systems, use the arrow to move it up, and then once we've made all the changes that we want, we'll hit the save button in the upper left-hand corner, and that will then modify the order of our chart tabs to match what we have in the setup screen. So if we look back to our chart tabs here, you'll see it now goes vitals, allergies, review of systems, and history. You'll always know which chart tab you're on because that chart tab will be highlighted in orange text like you see here. The ROS is highlighted because we selected the ROS chart tab. The first chart tab that's always displayed is going to be the summary. This by default is what displays when you open up a patient's chart. A few additional details that you can change or modify depending on your personal preferences. The very top of the screen here shows you a snapshot of kind of what's going on with the patient. You've got their allergies, medications, and problems. Some providers wonder, that information's always displayed here on the far right-hand side in the patient AMP. Do I really need it displayed on the summary? And again, that's totally up to you. That's a personal preference. If you choose to modify this information, simply right-click anywhere over a blank space in the summary screen and select Setup. That's going to give you the option to turn those details off or turn on additional details like the encounter details. So if we choose to turn on encounter details, you'll see a new tile shows up to give us even more information about the patient's appointment history. At the bottom of the screen, you have our award-winning timeline. The timeline can be modified as well. So if you choose, maybe I want the notes to display at the very top of the timeline instead of medications. Again, simply right-click anywhere in a blank space, select Setup, and you can select Notes, just like we did in our Chart tab reorganization, and move that above the medications. You may also want to turn on additional details, like maybe order results or lab results. Maybe we want to turn on our telehealth sessions. You can turn on all of those additional details to expand the space that we're utilizing for the timeline and create a more customized view. Again, by changing some of these details, you're only modifying your user account, and the data is saved, so the next time you log into the database, this same information is going to be represented for you. That's going to wrap up our EMR Overview User Preferences training. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.